Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. Bill Haslam is a businessman, a professor, and a politician who served as the governor of Tennessee from 2011 to 2019, and the mayor of Knoxville from 2003 to 2011. He's also the author of a new book called Faithful Presence: The Promise and the Peril of Faith in the Public Square, in which he explores how the church could be a force for reconciliation in our society and how Christians might help the country's divisions. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Governor Haslam, alongside my illustrious co-host, John Wood Jr., to discuss the book, his time in office, and his insights on the intersection of religion, politics, and the future of our country. Governor Haslam, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks. It's really a joy to be with you both, and I love what you're trying to do with the podcast and kind of the mission of Braver Angels. So thanks for letting me be a part of it today.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Well, before we jump into the book, I was just going to ask a little bit more about why are you here today? Why are you drawn to the mission of Braver Angels?
You know, for this, we get caught up in these political battles, and what kind of gets forgotten is all this stuff really matters, not maybe in the way that we yell about it and think about it's going to matter, but delivery of effective government really makes a difference, whether it's on the local, state, or federal level. And one of my passions is to have us focus a little less on the heat generated frequently by the media, who needs that heat to survive in their current market, our business model. Focus a little less on that and focus a little bit more on, all right, the whole theory, government's about how we organize ourselves to make decisions. And then about how do we provide services that people need for the tax dollars they pay, and to do that in an effective way. And I'd love to see the conversation reoriented to what we're really trying to do here.
Right. And your book is explicitly exploring the role of faith and church in the public square, in our public debate, and really in the social fabric. Can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for the book, and what are some of the central themes that you want people to take home?
I don't have to tell you all or probably any of your listeners the core issue of we're divided, and we're fairly evenly divided as a country. That's what people miss on both sides. I think everybody thinks like they do. But we're divided and we're mad, and we've even become contemptuous of the other side. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? And folks like you are trying to push that rock in one way. And the point of my book is this: people of faith look and see a world that's rapidly changing. It makes them scared in many cases. And because of that, we haven't reacted well in the public square. We've entered the public square out of fear, and that's never a good way to enter into anything. And so what I've said is, why don't we start by really doing what Jesus did when he talked about problems? He always started with us. He started with the people inside the faith. If you remember the famous story of the woman who's caught in adultery, she's, this crowd drags her before Jesus and said, "We caught her. You know what the law says, she should be stoned to death. What should we do?" And he basically starts with the religious crowd. He says, well, okay, let's start. Those of you who haven't sinned today, you go ahead and throw the first stone. And of course, the end result is they all drop their stones, and he tells her, now you go and sin no more. My point in telling that story is, Jesus always starts with us, the religious types. And the point of my book is, what if we started with ourselves instead of saying the world's going horribly wrong, and out of anger and frustration, and said, if Jesus says if the meat's going bad, it's not the meat's fault, it's the salt. The salt's supposed to keep the meat. The salt was a preservative in those days. The salt's supposed to keep the meat where it doesn't go bad. So let's start with ourselves.
Governor, you in the book give us a number of different examples of people who set a powerful example in terms of moral courage and Christian conduct. You talk some detail about Harriet Tubman, about William Wilberforce. One of the people you talk about is Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And it seems to me that a big part of what you're advocating in this book is a rootedness in sort of, I think, the virtues of the Christian faith over and above what some people have taken to be sort of the ideological, political program of, let's say, evangelical Christianity and so forth. I wanted to read to you the text of the pledge card that Martin Luther King Jr. And his comrades circulated during the Birmingham demonstrations, 1962, 1963, I believe. It's very short, but it reads as follows. It says, I hereby pledge myself, my person and body, to the nonviolent movement. Therefore, I will keep the following 10 commandments. Number 1, meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Number 2, remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Number 3, walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Number 4, pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. 5, sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. 6, observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. 7, seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. 8, refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. 9, strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. 10, follow the directions of the movement and of the captain of the demonstration. I sign this pledge having seriously considered what I do and with the determination and will to persevere. In that movement, and particularly in the episode in Birmingham here, each person who volunteered to be a part of those demonstrations, particularly if they were on the front lines, faced with the most difficult oppositional sort of hatred of, the powers that be at the time, were required to not just sign that card, but to genuinely commit to the spirit of that. And I get the sense in reading your book that in a way, you're sort of putting forward something, in a sense, similar. You seem to be calling people to lean into the internal character of what it means to walk like Christ in politics, rather than simply settling for mere cheerleading for partisan opinions. So I'm wondering if you can explore for us a little bit, how do you perceive this dynamic between being outwardly Christian in one's political opinions versus demonstrating sort of an inward Christian disposition in a way that delivers us towards the reconciliation that Dr. King, from his own Christian vantage point, was guiding us towards?
Yeah, so I'd say Dr. King kind of modeled both of those, right? He definitely was saying, hey, in signing this pledge, there's certain things that I'm asking you, or that we're all committing to in terms of how we act. Now, he obviously at the same time was advocating some political positions, I think back to the striking sanitation workers in Memphis that brought Dr. King to Memphis when he was assassinated in 1968. Dr. King was advocating those things, but he was saying, let's don't forget why we're doing this. And so because the why matters so much, how we do it matters too. And I think that's what's gotten lost. One of the points I'm trying to make in the book is this. There's lots of places that if you said, what do Christians in the public square care about? And they'd say, well, they care about issues around life and marriage and, a lot of other justice issues. We don't spend a lot of time talking about what should we act like. And, James says, wisdom that's from above is, and think about this in relationship to what was on the pledge card that Dr. King had. Wisdom that's from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to mercy, full of good fruits, impartial and sincere. I'm sorry, open to reason. I left out open to reason, impartial and sincere. And so what Dr. King was saying is how, as we're here protesting and advocating for these things, how we do that matters as well. And I'll add one last note. Congressman John Lewis, who died several months ago, was obviously one of the heroes of the civil rights movement. And I don't have the quote in front of me, so I'm going to botch the quote, but he had a great quote basically saying, what I'm afraid people will miss when they look back at what we did during those days is how rooted it was in our faith. That this movement, the civil rights movement of the 60s, was rooted in the faith of people like Dr. King and John Lewis.
Indeed. And as a follow-up to that, of course, and I think that you're absolutely correct, that what was done in those days was rooted in the faith of not just those two individuals, but a larger community of folks, most of whom African-American, but not all of whom, who drew their inspiration from Christ, even as, as King said, Gandhi helped supply the method, and there were others who helped inform that activism. But certainly, Dr. King was endlessly frustrated by the willingness of many people of faith, and certainly leaders and ministers at the time, to sit on the sidelines during what he and many other people, of course, considered to be sort of the great moral question of the time. And I suspect that you yourself must be frustrated at times, and maybe I should speak for myself. I find myself frustrated because it seems like in a moment wherein we can't learn how to forgive each other and how to hear each other as fellow Americans, that certainly the teachings of the gospel and the Christian traditions have something to say about how we can navigate our differences and be reconciled to each other in a spirit of forgiveness, even while we have an obligation to tell the truth as we see it. Do you encounter resistance to your message, the message that is in this book, from people who you might otherwise hope to be receptive to it? Because it seems like you're writing this book perhaps in response to the fact that the political culture of so much of American Christianity has become content to sort of ignore the idea that our speech should be seasoned with grace and that we should lead with the fruits of the Spirit, in favor of just sort of being like everybody else in politics, jumping into the food fight, without regard for these things.
Yeah, I do receive pushback, and I'm guessing it's the same that you all receive. Yeah. And that's folks who say, oh, that sounds really nice, Bill, but you don't realize there's too much at stake. Our very culture and the soul of America is at stake here. And so it's nice to have all that Sunday school language, but we can't bring a pillow to a knife fight. Mm. And the other side is using knives, so we better use knives as well. And my pushback would be this to those folks is this. Well, we don't say, okay, here's the first of all, my first pushback would be, well, that's actually Machiavelli who makes that argument. Who says, because of the circumstances, the ends justify the means. That's Machiavelli, not Jesus.
Which you say in the book, that we've taken we've imported a Machiavellian approach and disguised it as Christ, but that is not, not true to what was taught.
Right. And so what I feel like too many Christians have done is we've given ourselves a pass on how we act politically in ways that we don't in other ways. So I don't say, okay, you need to act ethically in your business unless you're about to go under, and then you can do what you need to, okay? Or I don't say you need to be faithful in your marriage unless there's a really attractive looking person in the cubicle next door. We don't make those kind of exceptions. But here we're saying, due to the circumstances, we're going to suspend how Scripture asks us to act. And we're going to act in ways that are just like everyone else. And again, if there's one clear message of the New Testament to Christians, and particularly the Sermon on the Mount, it's be different. The salt's supposed to be different than the meat. The light's supposed to be different than the dark. And we're not supposed to say, well, that's how the game's played, so we're going to play it that way.
Indeed.
To bring things back to politics, I'd be curious to hear you reflect on how you saw politics evolve or perhaps devolve over the course of your time in office, both in Tennessee and in national politics. I mean, you took office in 2011, a couple years into the Obama administration, and you were in office through the beginning of the Trump presidency. What were the dynamics you observed both locally and nationally, and what do you think are some of the driving deeper forces behind those?
Yeah, thanks. I think you're spot on in terms of the dramatic change. When I started running for governor in 2009, so that was kind of the rise of the Tea Party, et cetera, which kind of eventually morphs itself into the Trump run for president, et cetera. But the big changes, I think, are due to two or three things. You can't minimize the impact of social media. Again, when I ran for mayor, that was nowhere on the landscape. When I ran for governor, it was starting, but it wasn't. I mean, it was out there, but it wasn't nearly the factor it is now. And so what that has done is it's allowed the whole environment to get quite, I don't know a better word than meaner, because you can hide behind the anonymity of the internet. You can say things online that you would never, ever say to somebody in person. And we can talk to ourselves. So if I spend my whole day talking to people who live near me, and those people probably are more and more demographically like us, is what all the polling data shows, or people who go to the same church I do, or hang out at the same places I do, and then I go on social media and talk to people just like me, then pretty soon I start to think everybody is like me except for a few nuts on the other side. And so that's hardened our resolve. The second thing is we can now choose our news, and I can choose where on that spectrum I want to watch, and from way right to way left. And we all of us have confirmation bias, and we want to listen to people who tell us what we already believe to be true. So I can pick the news that already says what I want it to say. That's going to confirm my feelings that I'm right, and I'm going to dig in even further. And then I think the other big change is everything has become nationalized. And, with local media, very difficult business model, whether it be print or electronic. Most people's eyeballs and ears have been pulled toward, well, I'm going to listen to Fox or CNN or MSNBC, and I'm going to get my news from there, including, or actually in lieu of, local news of any type. And so what that's done is it's made me, number one, think what I believe is even more true, because I can choose my news and listen to social media. And then number two, I can, as I listen to those national news sources, and their media model is outrage, and their job is to get me fired up mad. It works, and I get madder, and then I get even less interested in how do I have some sort of constructive conversation with the other side.
How much does it cripple the work of an elected official when one's own supporters, perhaps primed by cable news and social media, so on and so forth, dehumanize or have such a dehumanized view of the other side, the other party, that I imagine it maybe has some effect on your ability to effectively, work across the aisle, maybe. I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that you were a Republican governor who put forward, and you talk about this in the book, a proposal during the, I guess, in the aftermath of the passage of the Affordable Care Act, when Medicaid was expanded, or the option to expand Medicaid to the states was there on the table for different governors to consider. You were opposed, I think, to the ACA in general, had serious criticisms of it, but you believed that for the benefit of the people of your state and those who you termed as the least of these, to borrow biblical language, that ultimately this Medicaid expansion was something that you felt the need to get behind. You put a proposal forward that ultimately failed in the legislature. But I get the impression that you suffered some blowback from folks who may have thought that you had sold out to a socialist agenda, I imagine, given the fact that Barack Obama was communist in chief for many Americans, being a bit tongue in cheek, but that's really the way a lot of folks felt. You know, folks considered Bush and then Trump later to be Nazis, so it's on all sides. But tell me how that shapes the environment of an elected official who wants to work in good faith across the aisle when, you know, folks who are behind you and on each side of this are primed to see the worst in some of the folks you have to work with.
Yeah, you put your finger on another really troublesome truth about government today. The folks on your side don't really want you to work something out with the other side. And in that case, like I said, I didn't think Affordable Care Act was handled right. I didn't think both the substance of it and the way it was passed were the right things to do. But once it was passed, we made some adjustments to it that I think did make it more fiscally responsible and conservative friendly, if you will. But because it was Obamacare, we had a lot of folks that are like, I'm not coming near that with a 10-foot pole, and please don't ask me to vote on it. And that's a great, even though what we ended up proposing, I think was more fiscally responsible than what we're doing now in the state. But because it was Obamacare, it was radioactive. I think the two points there. Number one, for all of us to remember, if you look at our Constitution, and I'm actually stealing this language from Bill Clinton, which is dangerous for a Republican politician to do, but Clinton said, famously said, the subtext of the Constitution is let's make a deal. We are designed as a country to where you really have to go make a deal to work something out. And our founders made a deal, right? A lot of them accepted slavery as part of our founding assumptions, even though a lot of them didn't want to do that. But in order to get the southern states to join them, they made a deal. Maybe it was a good deal, maybe it wasn't a bad deal, but it wouldn't have happened without that. Okay. And throughout time, we have figured out, then we set about as a nation trying to redeem that error and finally work it out that played itself out in the Civil War. But prior to that, even Lincoln, tried to make a deal from everything to get the 13th Amendment passed on to see if he could actually make progress. And so that was sort of a long-winded way around from the founders to Lincoln. But
no.
But I think what's missing today is this understanding that if we're actually going to make progress, you're going to have to come up with some compromises with the other side. And that is, that's horrible thought to most people.
If I wanted to ask too about sort of the latter part of your time in office. You were in office as the Trump phenomenon came to life, as he sort of, had his hostile takeover of the Republican Party, went on to win the 2016 election, and sort of turn the tables in a lot of ways in the White House. Obviously, whatever one thinks of Trump, it's hard to argue with the notion that he divides people. And he's prone to use demonizing languages and oftentimes positions sort of an us versus them mentality. Why do you think that sort of rhetoric, which I think in some ways your book is arguing against, was so popular with so many millions of Americans, including a very high number of Christians and evangelicals in particular?
It's a great question. It's kind of the question of our time, if you will. People like, how did this happen? I think two or three thoughts there. Number one, there were just a lot of people in our country who looked around and said, you business type Republicans, you all have left me. You've left me. You think the globalization of the economy and this and the technological advances we've made, you all think that's a good thing, but it's just left me on an island occupationally, and you've limited my options. And they looked around at the Democrats and said, well, y'all are talking about who gets to use which bathroom, and that's really not on my radar. And they were people without a home. And Donald Trump came in and said that I think there's a large group of Americans that I can build my base off of that feel just like that. I think then you add that to, and particularly with Christians, this sense of fear of, wow, the world is changing really fast. And, one of the lines I quote in the book is a person I know who says it feels like we went from being the home team to the visiting team in one generation. And that the world's changing so fast, it scares me. And Trump came along talking about the things that I'm worried about are slipping away. And he became a place that people rush to out of their fear. And I think the third thing is this: there's two ways to win elections in an evenly split, body like we are, like country, state, city, whatever it is. One is I'm going to try to persuade enough people on the other side, or enough who haven't made up their mind, to come my way. The second is to say, I'm going to double down and I'm going to do everything I can to get the people who are on my side to make sure they go vote. And that was Trump's approach. And not only did he make certain they voted, there were a lot of people he got to come vote who were low propensity voters who didn't typically vote. And he was able to double down on the base and then find those folks who felt like his base did but hadn't been voting, to narrowly win one election and barely lose another.
Were you surprised at the extent to which faith leaders lined up behind Trump?
Well, I was, particularly because of the way that some of those same folks had talked about Bill Clinton, however many years, 25, 27, whatever years before, 25 years before, or I guess 20 years before at that point. I think one of the things that's important for all of us to be is consistent. And so if we're going to say this matters in public office, we need to say this matters regardless of who's there.
One of the things that I was struck by in the book was a little story that you told about visiting what I think you said was the last open air slave market.
One of the last, yeah. We were in Tanzania, but right, one of the last.
Right, in Tanzania. And you told a story about your being there. I think you were with somebody who was from the area.
Right.
And just coincidentally, there was a delegation of African American mayors. Am I correct? Who were also.
You did a nice job of reading the book. I'm going to give you an A on the exam, but keep going.
Well, it's funny. I listened to most of it yesterday, and then this morning I listened to the rest, but I put it on at 2.5 times normal speed as I was trying to finish it before I got into the studio.
I don't want to know what I sound like at 2.5 times.
At 2.5 times, Bill Haslam sounds like Ben Shapiro. That's actually exactly how that works out.
One way to fix the Southern drawl.
There you go. So in the book, you recount this episode, and I had to just let you tell it. But there is a moment there of an exchange of an offering of repentance from one individual to this group, and then you reflect on the repentance that you did not offer, but I think sort of offer in the book. Would you mind just recapping that story for us a little bit, because I want to open up the issue of race here
Sure.
a little, and I think this might be a good way to do it.
Sure. We were in Tanzania, actually in Zanzibar, which is right off of Tanzania, and it was one of the last slave markets. And we're sitting there listening to the story, and the inhumanity of the story, when you listen to it, is reinforced and overwhelming. And somebody came up and, like I said, we're in Africa. I hadn't seen anybody that I knew, in the 10 days we'd been down there. And somebody tapped on my shoulder and said, "Excuse me, are you Bill Haslam?" And I said, Sure. Why? And they said, well, there's a group of African-American mayors here, and they recognized you and they'd like to have their picture made with you. And so I went and I was with a friend named Alexis Kwame, who lives in Kenya now, but is from the Congo. And as we met and talked with these mayors, he said, hey, I'd like to take this chance to apologize because there were a lot of folks who look like me who live in Africa. Our ancestors kidnapped your ancestors and sold them into slavery. And he told the story of how that had happened on the front end, that many Africans had been involved on the front end of the slave trade. And he said, I'm not aware of that being in my family, but on behalf of a lot of folks who are like me, I want to apologize. And I'm not doing the story justice. He did a wonderful job of talking about it and then talking about, asking forgiveness and the importance of repentance and then the gift of grace. And he walked all through that. And I sat there and I stood there and my wife Chrissy was with me and tears were coming out of our eyes. And the point I make in the book is that, and then I missed it. I missed the chance to say, on behalf of a lot of people who look like me, who live in my part of the United States, who then owned and mistreated your ancestors, I should have given the same apology, but I didn't. And I was so caught in his, and I mean, I'm like him, I don't know anybody in my family that owned slaves, but again, a lot of people who look like me and lived where I lived in the part of country I did. I missed a big chance to ask forgiveness. And the point of the story is all of us need to see that sense of have that sense of our own brokenness and need for forgiveness for a multitude of things in our past.
It's an interesting thing because in so much of the racial conversation today, I think that we get caught between these poles where on the one hand, I think you've got a lot of folks who are trying to sort of maybe force a certain spirit of contrition,
right,
through heavy-handed activism and so forth. And then you've got, I think, other folks who see any sort of concession in that direction as capitulation. So when I read that in your book, Governor, I was really struck by it because you clearly made a very deliberate decision to tell that story. But what occurs to me is that, I imagine you've probably, read Russell Kirk and the Conservative Mind and so forth. And in that book, which was the book that really launched kind of the intellectual conservative movements in America back in the 50s, Kirk talks about a lot of things that you don't hear conservatives talking about today. One of the things he talks about, and he looks at, takes Edmund Burke as a source for this point of view, but I think Edmund Burke said words to the effect of, I'm just going to roughly paraphrase, but we don't live merely in the present as individuals, but that we each of us live in connection with our ancestors who have gone before us and those who come after us. And there's a way in which I think it is not unconservative to think that while it is certainly true that we exist as individuals and that the individual is sovereign and we ought not be blamed for what our ancestors did, nevertheless, is there not some nobility in taking responsibility for the legacy that is passed down to us in all of its highlights and all of its glory and the triumph of the Declaration and the Revolution, but to also say that we exist in the flow of these stories of these different groups who are thrown together here in America. Let us figure out how we can move towards reconciliation in a way that's reflective of that heritage. I'm wondering if anything in what you felt on this moment strikes you as unconservative, or on the other hand, is it very much conservative to do as you did, or to reflect as you have reflected on it?
I think it is conservative to borrow Chesterton's phrase, "What's wrong with the world? I am."
Yes.
I teach some university classes, and I'm always struck when I talk to those classes. There's a real willingness to talk about, systemic racism or systemic, errors of all different types. There's much less willingness to talk about, to own individual racism, individual sin, individual error, whatever all the different things you want to call it. And I know there's a huge debate, like in my state, the legislators this past year passed a ban on teaching critical race theory. Mm-hmm. And while I understand that there's some things that come with critical race theory that I believe me, I understand engender lots of conversation on both sides. What I don't want us to do is to put ourselves in a position where we can't go back and fully acknowledge the errors that we have made. Mm. And so I look at our country and go, listen, I think this is the greatest country on the earth, period. Okay. I wouldn't trade it for anywhere else. But I also know we've got a lot of things in our past that weren't right. And we need to talk about those. And if we're going to form a more perfect union, then we have to talk about those things that have made us a less perfect union in the past.
In these last couple minutes, I'd like to just ask, where do we go from here? Because I think a lot of people would say things are getting worse, not better. Obviously Donald Trump is out of office, but if the Republican primary were held today, it's most likely that Trump would be the nominee. You have the very issue of democracy itself becoming a partisan issue. You have tens of millions of Americans who think the 2020 election was illegitimate. So I wonder, what is a positive vision, but also just practically speaking, how can we get there, both in the political and the religious realms?
Yeah, so I'll start, because my book is not solely to people of faith. If you're not a person of faith, I hope you'll still read it to think about what's the role of faith in the public square, because that's kind of the bigger question that I want to ask. But I would start with, again, you always start with your own people. And I would start with people of faith and say, what if we started to walk in the manner worthy of the gospel when we walked in the public square, and not just in a manner in which our swords are drawn when we enter trying to kill the bad guys? So that'd be the first thing I'd say. The second thing is to all of us, like, who say, well, no, the stakes are too high, whether you're a person of faith or not, the stakes are too high, we have to battle. I'd say, well, how's that working out for us right now? And we literally have a government that can barely get anything done. And senators I know who, on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, when you ask about a hard problem that we're facing as a country and how we're going to solve that, they go, oh, I gave up on doing hard stuff a long time ago. It's just, it's too hard. If it's going to take working with the other side and coming up with thoughtful, strategic decisions, we can't do it. So I would encourage you to elect people who understand that, as Ronald Reagan used to say, if I can get 80% of what I want, that's pretty good. And the people who think I have to have 100% and or I'll just go off the cliff with my flag flying, it's a bad path. The last thing I'd say is this: there are encouraging signs out there, and I would point to things happening in local communities around the country where people have kind of shoved aside all the red and blue stuff and said, oh, that's fine, but in the meantime, we have to solve this problem, and they're actually doing that. And try to elect people. And this last thing I'll say, when you get ready to vote for somebody, everybody thinks, well, where are they on the political spectrum? And do they match where I am? I would encourage you to think this way instead. Is this person more interested in making a point or in making a difference? And our world rewards you for making a point, and you can become a social media star like that. But I'd way rather elect somebody who's there to make a difference, even if they're not ideologically right at the same place on the spectrum that I am.
Well, I think that's a great place to end the conversation. At Braver Angels, we always encourage people to get involved with their local communities. So many people just spend all their time at home thinking about national politics and they feel helpless. But we've launched alliances where people can work with their quote unquote opponents on issues of common concern that don't touch on such ideologically intense themes. So it was great to have you here today. To all our listeners, if you want to send in questions, comments, criticisms, compliments, we take it all. And
we get it all, that's for sure.
We get it all. And that's how we know we're doing something right, if we're getting criticism from Reds and Blues. So thank you, Governor Haslam, for making time, and we'll have to have you back on at some point in the future.
And once again, the book is Faithful Presence, The Promise and the Peril of Faith in the Public Square. We'll include a link to that in the description. Governor, thank you so much.
Thank you both. I enjoyed being with you.
Absolutely. And for folks who are watching us, who support our mission and who want to join us as a member, you can do that at braverangels.org. You can get involved in your local community, your local alliance, and likewise, like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We are building a house united. Ciaran O'Connor, John Wood Jr. Till next time.